In the dead of night, something was not right. A figure, larger than life, darker than the shadows themselves, stood guard over an ancient grave. But it wasn't the mournful presence of a loved one. No, this was something different. Something that would change the course of history for a small, peaceful village. This wasn't just any gorilla. It had appeared out of nowhere days before, roaming the graveyard with an unsettling, singular purpose. It never strayed far from the grave, never looked away from it, not once. The locals whispered about it, unsure whether to be terrified or awed. But one thing was certain, they couldn't ignore it. Calls were made, and the police arrived at the scene. At first, they thought it was a wild animal, just lost or confused. But the longer they watched, the more they realized this gorilla wasn't like any animal they'd ever encountered. It was as if it was guarding something, protecting something. But what? As the officers approached, they could feel it, an uneasy tension hanging in the air. The gorilla didn't flinch. It didn't even move a muscle. Instead, it stood there, its eyes never leaving the grave. In that moment, a chill ran down the spines of those who witnessed it. Was this simply the behavior of a confused animal? Or was there something darker at play? The closer they got, the more they realized they were dealing with something beyond their understanding. Something far more than just a gorilla in a graveyard. To the untrained eye, the grave might have seemed like any other. But the symbol carved into its stone, something old, something ancient, hinted at a story long buried, a secret that had been hidden for generations, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And now, as the police closed in, they were about to uncover that secret, whether they were ready for it or not. Little did they know, they were about to face something so terrifying, it would freeze them in place, paralyze them with fear. And as the gorilla stood firm, guarding the grave, one question remained. What was it trying to protect? The small village where this strange event unfolded was the kind of place you'd expect to see in a postcard. Quiet, peaceful, and untouched by the outside world. Nestled between thick forests and rolling hills, it was the sort of place where everyone knew each other, and nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. That is, until the gorilla appeared. For generations, the villagers had passed down stories of eerie happenings in the graveyard, just outside the village's edge. Some of them were simple superstitions, whispers of restless spirits, eerie lights in the distance, and strange sounds echoing through the night. But others were darker. There were those who spoke of old curses and forgotten rituals, of things buried deep beneath the earth that were never meant to be disturbed. The graveyard itself was an ancient one. The stones were worn by time, some cracked, others completely illegible, as though the names had been erased by forces beyond natural wear. It was a place that many locals avoided after sundown, preferring not to linger near the old graves. But even those who dared to visit in the daylight spoke of a strange, uneasy feeling that seemed to hang in the air, as though the ground beneath their feet was hiding something it didn't want anyone to uncover. And yet, despite the stories, the village had remained relatively untouched by the supernatural. No one had truly believed that the whispers and tales could hold any truth. That is, until the gorilla arrived. The first sighting occurred a few days before the incident that would shake the village. At first, no one knew where the gorilla had come from. It wasn't typical for such creatures to wander into populated areas, and especially not into a graveyard. The villagers were used to seeing wildlife on the outskirts, but never anything like this. This large, powerful animal that seemed intent on one thing, guarding that grave. Days passed, and the gorilla didn't leave. It was as though something had compelled it to stay. Every time someone tried to approach, the creature would growl and stare them down with an intensity that sent chills through their spine. The villagers became more and more curious and afraid. Was it just an animal lost and confused? Or was there something else at play here? What was this creature doing in a place so steeped in mystery and fear? The local authorities were alerted. but they were just as perplexed as everyone else. No one could explain the gorilla's strange behavior. They'd seen wild animals before, but nothing like this. The creature seemed to be waiting for something, as if it had a specific purpose, a duty it had to fulfill. And that, more than anything, was what unsettled the villagers the most. With each passing day, the gorilla's presence became more ominous. Some began to whisper that it wasn't just guarding the grave, but protecting it from anyone who dared to come too close. Others speculated that it was there to warn the village, perhaps of something buried beneath the soil, something dark that should never be disturbed. The air grew thick with tension, and the sense of dread became inescapable. Finally, the police decided they couldn't ignore it any longer. They had to figure out what was going on. They couldn't leave a wild animal like that unaccounted for, especially not near the graveyard. So, they made the decision to investigate further, hoping that once the gorilla was dealt with, things could go back to normal. But little did they know, their investigation would open the door to something far more terrifying than they ever could have imagined. The decision was made. The police arrived on the scene, armed with their usual procedures for dealing with wildlife. They approached cautiously, unsure of what to expect, but hoping they could contain the situation without incident. But as they drew closer to the graveyard, the weight of the situation hit them. The air was thick with tension, and something felt wrong. The gorilla was still there, standing firm beside the grave. It hadn't moved an inch. It was as if time itself had stopped for this creature, as though it had no intention of leaving, no matter who came near. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. They'd dealt with wild animals before, but never one that seemed so focused, so determined. This wasn't an animal that had wandered into the area by accident. No, this gorilla had a purpose. At first, the officers tried a calm approach. They spoke to it, calling out in gentle tones, hoping to coax the gorilla away from the grave. But the creature didn't respond. Its eyes never left the tombstone, its posture rigid and unyielding. It was a silent standoff, one that felt like it had been going on for hours, even though only minutes had passed. One officer slowly stepped forward, holding up a tranquilizer gun, trying to reassure the others that everything would be fine. But as soon as he moved closer, the gorilla's eyes shifted, locking onto him with an intensity that made the officer freeze. The stare was cold, calculating, as if the animal was daring him to make a move. The tension was unbearable. The officers huddled together, whispering to one another, unsure how to proceed. Every attempt to move closer was met with the same unblinking stare from the gorilla. It wasn't aggressive, at least not in the traditional sense, but it was clear that this creature wasn't going to back down. Some of the officers began to wonder if they were dealing with something beyond their expertise. Could it be an animal that had become territorial, or was there something else at play? Could the grave hold some significance that even the gorilla was aware of, something that the police hadn't yet discovered? Then, without warning, the gorilla let out a low, guttural growl. It wasn't loud, but it sent a shockwave through the group. The growl was deep, primal, an unmistakable warning. The officer with the tranquilizer gun hesitated, the fear creeping up his spine. This was no ordinary encounter. And that's when the realization hit. The gorilla wasn't just standing there. It was guarding something it wouldn't let anyone near. The air grew heavier, and the officers exchanged uncertain looks. This wasn't an animal that could simply be frightened off, and it was clear that no amount of force would make the gorilla leave the grave willingly. In fact, it seemed as though the closer they got, the more determined the creature became to defend its position. As the moments passed, the growing sense of dread among the officers intensified. Whatever the gorilla was protecting, it was something far more valuable than just a patch of earth. It was guarding a secret, one buried so deeply in the grave that even the gorilla couldn't bring itself to leave it unprotected. And that, more than anything, terrified the officers more than they were willing to admit. They knew they had to make a decision. Should they try to force the gorilla away, or should they dig deeper into the mystery of why it was there, standing watch over the grave, but no one could have predicted what would happen next. The decision was made. The officers knew they couldn't leave the situation unresolved. The gorilla had been guarding the grave for days, and no one could say why. But there was one thing they all agreed on. Something wasn't right. It was time to open the grave and find out what was really going on. With the gorilla still standing steadfast beside it, the police moved cautiously toward the tombstone. The atmosphere was thick with unease. The ground around the grave had started to sink in some areas, as if it had been disturbed recently. But there was no sign of anyone else nearby. Just the gorilla, watching them intently, refusing to budge. The officers stood around the grave, unsure of how to begin. Some suggested calling in a team of experts. Others wanted to move the gorilla first, but the decision was made. They had to open it now. They couldn't risk waiting any longer, not with the gorilla showing no signs of leaving. One officer began clearing away the dirt carefully, each shovel full, making the air heavier with tension. As the dirt was removed, a strange silence settled over the group. The gorilla watched with an eerie stillness, its eyes following every movement the officers made. It was as if it understood what they were doing, and it wasn't about to let them uncover whatever lay beneath the soil. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the last layer of dirt was cleared away. The wooden lid of the grave came into view, cracked and weathered, as if it had been sitting untouched for centuries. A few more officers moved forward, lifting the lid with slow, deliberate movements, their hands trembling as they worked. The weight of the moment was crushing. And then, as the lid shifted open just enough to reveal the interior, a collective gasp escaped the group. What lay inside was nothing they could have prepared for. It wasn't just bones or a body. It was something far more disturbing. The grave had been sealed for a reason. Inside, wrapped in a cloth, was an object, an artifact of some kind, its shape dark and twisted. There were markings on it, symbols, carvings that none of the officers could understand. But they all recognized something in that moment. This wasn't just any grave. This was a tomb meant to keep something hidden, something dangerous. Before anyone could react, a wave of fear washed over them. It wasn't just the grotesque nature of the object. It was the feeling, the sense that something had been disturbed, something that shouldn't have been touched. The officers stood frozen, unable to look away. The air seemed to shift, becoming heavier, suffocating. They could feel their hearts pounding in their chests. And that's when it happened. The gorilla let out a loud, thunderous roar. It was a sound so powerful, so primal, that the officers froze in place, paralyzed by fear. The ground seemed to tremble beneath them. The creature wasn't just reacting to the grave being opened, it was reacting to the object inside. It was warning them, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. The officers were rooted to the spot, unable to move. Fear gripped them like a vice. The gorilla, its eyes wide with fury, began to move toward them, each step deliberate, as if it was preparing to strike. But it wasn't attacking. No, it was more like it was showing them, warning them of the consequences of what they had just unleashed. In that moment, the officers realized the truth. What they had uncovered wasn't just an artifact. It was a key to something much darker, something ancient and powerful. And now, with the gorilla standing over them, they understood why it had been guarding the grave all this time. It wasn't protecting a body, it was protecting a secret that was never meant to be revealed. Now, with the truth staring them in the face, they had no choice but to deal with the consequences of their actions. But the question lingered in their minds. What else had they unleashed? And would they survive what came next? The officers were frozen in place, their eyes locked on the gorilla as it slowly circled the open grave. The air was thick with tension, and every breath felt like a weight on their chests. The creature's eyes never left them, a silent warning in its gaze. They knew they had disturbed something ancient, something far beyond their understanding. But even more terrifying was the realization that the gorilla wasn't the true threat. It was what lay hidden beneath the ground. As the gorilla continued its slow, deliberate movements, the officers couldn't tear their eyes away from the object in the grave. The markings on it seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, almost as if the very presence of the gorilla was keeping the dark force inside at bay. The air seemed to hum with an unnatural power, and a strange sensation washed over the group, a sensation that something terrible was about to unfold. For a moment, the officers considered retreating. They thought about sealing the grave again and leaving the gorilla to its duty. But deep down, they knew they couldn't just walk away. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't just affecting them, it was affecting the entire village. The discovery in the grave was more than a mystery. It was a warning. The question was, what was it trying to warn them of? Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the graveyard. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shudder, as if the very earth itself was reacting to the object in the grave. The gorilla froze, its body tense, its eyes wide with an almost human-like fear. The officers watched, horrified, as the object in the grave began to move on its own. It wasn't the wind or some natural force. It was as if the artifact had come to life, responding to something unseen. With a violent jolt, the artifact began to rise from the grave, slowly at first, then faster, as if it were being pulled by an invisible force. The officers backed away, but they couldn't look away. It wasn't just the artifact that was moving. It was as if something inside the grave itself had awakened. The ground around the tombstone began to crack open, and a dark, shadowy form began to emerge, a form that seemed to stretch beyond human comprehension. The gorilla let out another roar, more desperate this time, but it was too late. Whatever had been locked away in that grave for so long was now free. And it wasn't just the gorilla that was watching over the grave anymore. The entire graveyard seemed to come alive with a dark energy, the shadows shifting and twisting, as if the very land itself was reclaiming what had been buried. As the officers scrambled to understand what was happening, they realized the full extent of their mistake. The grave hadn't just been a burial site, it had been a prison for something ancient, something evil that had been contained for centuries. And now, with the creature free, the village would pay the price for disturbing its tomb. The gorilla, still standing vigil over the grave, seemed to recognize the danger. Its posture had shifted from one of guardianship to one of frantic protection. It wasn't just guarding the grave anymore. It was trying to keep whatever had been released from wreaking havoc on the world. But there was only so much it could do. The officers, now paralyzed by fear, could only watch as the shadows continued to rise, spreading outward from the grave like a plague. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went still. The shadows froze, the artifact fell back into the grave, and the ground sealed itself once more. The gorilla let out a final, sorrowful cry, as if mourning the release of something that could never be undone. The officers stood motionless, too stunned to speak, their minds racing with the horror of what they had just witnessed. The silence stretched on, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though everything might return to normal. But deep down, they all knew the truth. The village would never be the same again. The secret that had been buried for centuries had been unleashed, and now, the true terror had only just begun. The officers, still in shock, barely had the strength to move. The grave was once again sealed. The shadows had returned to their place beneath the earth, and yet, the unease lingered. The gorilla, its once powerful form now slumped and defeated, let out a mournful cry as it turned away from the grave. Its mission, its duty, was over. But the officers knew that this wasn't the end of the story. Fear gripped them like a vice, but it was more than just the terror of what had happened in the graveyard. It was the realization that whatever had been unleashed wasn't gone. It was still there, waiting. They didn't know what kind of power had been released, but they knew it wasn't something the world was ready to face. The weight of their discovery pressed down on them, as if the very earth itself was trying to swallow them whole. As they began to slowly retreat from the graveyard, Their minds were racing with questions. What had they seen? What had they just uncovered? The villagers would need to know, but how could they explain it? How could they even begin to describe what had just happened? And the gorilla, what had been its role in all of this? Had it known what would happen? Or had it been just as much a prisoner as the artifact? The police chief, trying to regain some sense of composure, ordered the others to return to the village and report what had happened. But as they walked away from the graveyard, the unease grew stronger. The sound of the wind through the trees, the distant calls of the night creatures, felt somehow hollow, like the world had changed, and they were walking through a dream. But this was no dream. What had been unleashed in that graveyard was real, and now it was free. Back in the village, whispers spread like wildfire. The officers tried to keep things under control, but the story was already out. No one could deny what had been seen, even if no one could understand it. People gathered in the town square, speaking in hushed tones, casting nervous glances toward the graveyard that now seemed more like a portal to something otherworldly. Something that wasn't meant to be unleashed. The police had hoped to keep things under wraps, but the strange occurrences continued. The village wasn't the same. People began to report unusual sights, strange lights flickering in the woods, unnatural sounds echoing through the night, even the animals behaving strangely, as if they too were aware of the darkness now spreading through the land. Something had shifted, and no one knew if it could ever be undone. As the days passed, the tension only grew. The gorilla was never seen again, but its presence lingered in the memories of everyone who had witnessed the events at the grave. Some believed that the creature had been the only thing standing between them and something far worse. Others feared that the gorilla had failed in its duty, that whatever had been freed from the grave would soon make its way into the village, bringing with it an ancient curse that could never be stopped. But one thing became clear. The grave had been opened, the artifact had been disturbed, and now, whatever had been lurking beneath the surface was out in the world, free to do whatever it wanted. The question on everyone's mind was simple. What would happen next? And would the village survive what had been set into motion that fateful night? The story didn't end in the graveyard. No, the true terror was just beginning. Because the forces that had been released were only just starting to wake up, and no one, not the officers, not the villagers, not even the gorilla, could predict what would come next. The days that followed were filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. The village that once thrived in peace now felt like a place trapped in time, a place where the normal rhythms of life had been disrupted by an unseen force. The air seemed to thicken. The sky above weighed down with an unnatural heaviness. People kept to themselves, and those who had dared venture too close to the graveyard spoke of strange occurrences, footsteps where no one had walked, sudden gusts of wind that carried an unsettling chill, and shadows that seemed to move against the flow of the wind. The villagers were terrified, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching them, waiting. Many of them began to speak of strange dreams, of being chased by dark figures, or of hearing voices calling them in the dead of night. The supernatural had always been a part of their folklore, but this felt different. It felt real. Something had been unleashed, something that was now very much a part of their world. Even the police chief, who had seen his fair share of strange cases, was visibly shaken. He gathered the officers together, trying to maintain order, but it was clear that they were all beginning to unravel. They had made a mistake. They had opened the grave, disturbed something ancient, and now the consequences were unfolding in ways they couldn't control. The chief insisted that they stay vigilant, that they keep watch over the graveyard, but deep down, he knew it wasn't enough. Whatever had been released was beyond their comprehension. They weren't just dealing with an artifact or a cursed object anymore. They were dealing with a force, something far more powerful than any of them could have imagined. And then, one night, it happened. Another group of officers was assigned to patrol the graveyard, their nerves already frayed from the events that had taken place. As they approached the now sealed grave, the air grew cold. The ground felt like it was pulsing, as though the very earth was alive. They hesitated, looking at each other in disbelief. The grave had been sealed. The artifact was returned to its resting place, but the unsettling sensation lingered. Something was still out there. As the officers moved closer, one of them swore he saw something in the distance, a figure standing tall in the shadows. They called out, but the figure didn't respond. They moved cautiously toward it, the hairs on the back of their necks standing on end. But when they reached the spot where the figure had been standing, there was nothing. Just empty ground. Just silence. It was then that they heard it, an eerie, low hum, rising from beneath the ground. It wasn't a sound that could be explained by nature, and it wasn't the wind. It was a vibration that seemed to shake the very air around them. The officers froze, paralyzed by fear. They had heard rumors, whispers from the older villagers about an ancient power that had been buried deep beneath the graveyard, but no one had believed it. Not until now. The humming grew louder, almost deafening, as the ground around them began to tremble. The officers stumbled back, fear seizing their every movement. The night seemed to grow darker, the stars above flickering and dimming as if they were being swallowed by the darkness. And then, from deep beneath the earth, a deep voice, low and guttural, rose from the ground, sending shivers down their spines. The voice spoke in a language they didn't understand, but its meaning was clear. It was a warning, a curse, and it wasn't just directed at them, it was for everyone in the village. In that moment, the officers knew the truth. The terror they had witnessed, the force that had been awakened, was not just confined to the graveyard. It was spreading. It was already too late. The gorilla had tried to protect them, but it had failed. The village was now in the grip of an ancient evil, one that had been dormant for centuries. And now, the consequences of disturbing the grave were beginning to unfold. The village was no longer safe, and whatever had been unleashed would stop at nothing to fulfill its purpose. The voice echoed again, this time closer, as if it was coming from the very earth beneath their feet. The officers could barely move, overwhelmed by a sense of impending doom. There was no escape. Whatever had been set into motion could not be undone. One by one, the officers turned and fled, racing back to the village, hoping that they could warn the others. But it was already too late. The curse had been unleashed, and the village would never be the same. They had opened the grave, and now they would have to face the consequences of their actions. Consequences that could very well destroy everything they had ever known. As the officers raced back, they couldn't shake the feeling that the force they had unleashed was following them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The village was no longer just a peaceful town. It was a place haunted by the past, a place cursed by ancient forces beyond their control.